All right, so we are talking about Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan today. Jimmy Carter comes into office after Gerald Ford takes over for Nixon. Now, in the last class, I talked about Nixon. Nixon is the only president ever to resign from office. Okay, he's the only president ever to be told he's got to leave. Now, I'm going to do a basic overview of Watergate because it sets up pretty much the entire 1970s. And it's the biggest scandal in American political history, depending upon who you talk to. Because if you talk to current political scientists, some are arguing that the Trump years are going to eclipse that. Some are arguing that Clinton would eclipse that. This is basically what Nixon did. And you have to understand Watergate again to understand why we end up with Jimmy Carter, okay? Richard Nixon comes into office. You guys talked about LBJ the last time we were in here, okay? When LBJ, gives way to Nixon taking over in 1969, Nixon is very successful, especially on the foreign policy front. He manages to ease tensions with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. He opens up relations with China for the first time since the Chinese had their communist revolution after World War II. He manages to kind of ease the tensions of the Cold War. And he seems to also open up trade relations with a number of different countries, forming things like the G7, which officially formed during Gerald Ford's term. So there's a lot of good things that Nixon does. Okay, even his biggest detractors will say that Richard Nixon was doing a pretty decent job. And the easiest way to kind of point out how well he's doing is that he easily wins re-election in 1972. He wins in a walk. Okay, George McGovern doesn't even come close. So Nixon rides a wave of popularity into a second term. Yet, during the 1972 election, Nixon has a group of people as part of his re-election campaign who get caught breaking into the Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate Hotel. That's why it's called Watergate, okay? The Watergate Hotel is where the Democrats held their national convention, had their national offices. And these 5 individuals that worked for his re-election campaign got caught breaking in. Now, the acronym for the Nixon re-election campaign in 1972 was the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP, one of the dumbest named, groups in American history. If you're running for re-election to an office, you probably don't want to call your followers members of CREEP, okay? But that's literally what they were called, okay? They get caught breaking in. Now, these 5 individuals are disowned immediately by Nixon, disowned immediately by CREEP. Everybody says, oh, they're just little low-level flunkies. They did this on their own. We had no knowledge of this. But these guys were really shady individuals from the start. When they got caught by a night watchman who noticed that the door to the Democratic National Headquarters basically had been taped over. And for those of you who don't know what that means, if you open up my door and you put a piece of duct tape or something over the latch, you can just slide it open and shut. Okay, it prevents it from locking, if you will. Well, he noticed that piece of tape, removed it, heard some people talking from the inside, and just locked them in, called the police. That's legitimately how they got caught. Okay? Well, when these 5 individuals were caught and taken downtown for questioning, for breaking and entering, they pretended they didn't speak English. Okay? They pretended they were Cuban. Kept saying, no hablas inglés, no hablas inglés. So they brought in an interpreter to question them. The interpreter spends 5 minutes with them, walks out and goes, I don't know who those guys are, but they ain't Cuban. They don't know any Spanish, and what they do know, they don't have a good accent, so they're definitely hiding something. Of course, when they finally figure out that they work for CREEP, immediately Nixon's asked about it. They all disown these guys, say, hey, they were working on their own, we have no idea what they were doing, how embarrassing, that's terrible. And they basically refuse to do anything to help these guys. Okay? And the whole situation gets, kind of shoved under the rug. Nobody ever pays attention to it. But during the course of the campaign, 2 very low-level writers that work for the Washington Post, guys named Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, Woodward and Bernstein, basically make a contact in the White House who basically starts passing along information like, yes, these guys were known by the White House staff, that Nixon knew about this break-in, and more importantly, he knew about the cover-up of it, okay? they start printing all these different articles that basically accuse Nixon of knowing all about this break-in and planning it, okay? Nixon denies it, and then their contact in the White House kind of gives the silver bullet, if you will, by saying Nixon, who is a paranoid individual in his own right, okay? Nixon was very paranoid as a person, okay? Nixon bugged his own White House. He bugged his own Oval Office. He taped everything that happened in the Oval Office, okay? So any meeting he ever had, there were tapes of who said what and when. Now why? He was worried that somebody was going to come in, say something to him, or they were going to have a meeting, and then somebody was going to try and double cross him, so he always wanted to have everybody on tape to make sure that nobody could double cross him. The sad thing was is that they held meetings talking about the break-in, planning it, and then also covering it up in the Oval Office. So when Woodward and Bernstein got these tapes, they were able to prove that Nixon not only knew about it, but lied about it, okay? Because of this, the House of Representatives basically starts their impeachment proceedings. They start basically looking into this, and it looks very like a slam dunk. He's going to be impeached, and remember, impeached does not mean he's removed from office. It means he's brought up on formal charges. While they're doing that, Barry Goldwater, who we talked about running against LBJ in '64, he was still in the Senate. Barry Goldwater started polling all the Republican senators, and a bunch of them were saying, there's no way we're going to back Nixon, that he is guilty. So they basically tell Goldwater, hey, if he is impeached and we actually hold a trial, we will vote for guilt. We will remove him from office. Goldwater goes to the White House, talks to Nixon, says, look, no matter what you say, I don't have the votes to hold on to you. Nixon makes the decision to then just resign from office. So he's never impeached for this. He's never removed from office. He removes himself, okay? That's what Watergate is in a nutshell, okay? So needless to say, Gerald Ford steps into the office. Gerald Ford, never having been elected as vice president, because the vice president for Nixon was a guy named Spiro Agnew, who was also kind of shady in his own right. He had problems with his income taxes while he was governor of Maryland and kind of did some shady stuff, so he resigned already. Ford was just plugged in, and then Nixon resigned, and Ford moves up to the presidency. So Gerald Ford was never elected to the presidency, was never elected to the vice presidency. He's your only president never to be elected to either office. Okay? Ford takes over, does some things while he's in office that kind of make everybody in America either hate him or just decide he's really not the guy that needs to lead America. And so they look for kind of the white knight, the knight in shining armor, the guy that has no scandals or anything. And they find it in a peanut farmer from Georgia named Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter comes out of nowhere, wins the Democratic nomination by basically saying, I'm a political outsider. If you've ever heard that term before, it starts with Carter. Carter is the one that plays up the idea that he's not been in Washington, D.C. He's a governor of a southern state who has no Washington, D.C. credentials, no connection to Watergate, no connection to Nixon, no connection to anything. And he's coming in from the outside to shake up Washington. So Carter gets elected because of that, okay? Now, it also doesn't help that Ford is painted as a buffoon, the poor guy. Gerald Ford was always painted as being somebody that was a little out of touch. He was somebody that was a little, old and, just, the poor guy fell down a lot. He was a football player when he was in college, played at the University of Michigan. He had no knees anymore. He basically had knee problems. So not surprisingly, when he was walking up the steps of Air Force One, he'd trip and fall down every once in a while. Joe Biden can feel bad about it too. Biden's fallen down a few times on the steps. The real bad one was when he was in Germany, meeting with the Chancellor of West Germany. He fell down the steps. He literally took a tumble all the way down in wet conditions. Stood up like a champ and shook hands with the guy, but that was Ford. Okay? Biden tripped up the steps of Air Force One 3 times in a row. Okay. This was Ford, okay? Carter comes in. He's a young governor. He's somebody that's smooth talking. He's got the really toothy grin that makes everybody feel like, all right, this guy's just, yeah, he's a goober, but, he's our goober, And it's kind of like, if you don't want scandals, then go with Carter. The problem is, While Carter doesn't have any scandals, he's got some people around him that are just plain ridiculous, including his brother. His brother's a moron. You know, Billy Carter is a real big problem. His children become a problem while he's in the White House, because his children very famously admit that they were smoking weed on the roof of the White House the entire time they were in the White House. Okay, Carter's. So Carter is just surrounded by a cast of people where you're just like, man, this poor guy, just he can't seem to win.
It was the 70s and 80s.
Okay. So Jimmy Carter takes over in 1977, comes in as the political outsider, and he immediately looks like he is kind of outmatched for the job. You know, that he's not quite ready for this. What happens is the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. A bunch of senators and congressmen say, we need to get involved, we need to push them out. Carter does not want to do that because so far the Cold War is called the Cold War because we haven't fought them directly. So his mindset is, let's see what happens. But he does get involved. He does get involved, just indirectly. He does exactly what the Soviets were doing when we were in Vietnam. Instead of getting involved directly, we just funnel money, we funnel resources, we give everything we possibly can to the freedom fighters in Afghanistan to fight the conflict. You know, really nice people like the Taliban. Gave them millions of dollars.
I love those guys.
Even this really nice Saudi guy that kind of said, hey, I'm going to go over there and I'm going to, you know, set up a network of people that disrupt the Soviets and bomb their, you know, their military installations. They were called Al-Qaeda. Okay? The guy's name was Osama bin Laden. We gave him roughly $3 million. Okay? Now, of course, we took a lot of those resources after the Soviets gave up on Afghanistan and used it to train people to then come back and bomb us. Okay? So, again, not the greatest. Carter and Reagan both shoulder the burden for that because they were the ones that were doing this. Okay? Carter's the one that starts it, though, so he tends to get most of the blame. Okay? The Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan is completely you know, just panned by every other freedom-loving nation. You know, anybody that isn't the Soviet Union basically looks at them and says, why are you doing this? And it ends up being their version of Vietnam. You know, they get waist deep in it and realize this is a mess, how the hell do we get out? Okay, which is basically what happened to us in Vietnam. Okay? Now, it's not all bad. Carter does attempt to limit the arms race with the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, the second one, SALT. Okay? That's what it stands for. SALT II is, again, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. It's an agreement between the Soviet Union and the United States to limit productions of nuclear weapons. So instead of trying to blow up the Earth multiple times, we're going to try and only do it once. Okay? Maybe twice. Okay? At the height of the arms race, we had enough weapons to blow up the Earth. The Soviets had enough weapons to blow up the Earth roughly 3 or 4 times.
Wow.
Okay? Seems ridiculous, right? We could do it 5 times. Yeah. America. You would think once is enough, but not during the arms race. Okay? So needless to say, this is trying to limit the amount in our arsenals. Okay? Because we had, to say the least, overdone it. Okay? Carter at least manages to get that signed. Whether or not they're actually going to follow it is, of course, subject to all kinds of criticism either way. Carter's main low point came when he gave a speech called, it's called either the malaise speech or the crisis of confidence speech. He basically gets on national television and says, for the first time ever, people, young people, think that they were better off 4 years ago than they are today. That they're, you know, not really in a good country anymore, and that they're not proud to be an American. And it was a real Debbie Downer speech. Now, the thing is, most political commentators and historians look at this and they say, you know what, he wasn't wrong, but you don't want, that's not what you want in your president. You want a president that's going to stand up and say some nonsense, like the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. To where you can say, he gets it. You don't want your president to be like, hey, you're all depressed, and I understand why. You know, this country sucks. Okay? You want, I know a lot of you are going to say, no, I would want this. But you, as Americans, you do want a president that's going to lie to you a little bit. You know? You want the president that's going to stand up and give the rah-rah speech. You don't want the president that's going to say, you know, if you all worked harder, we'd be a lot better off than where we're at. I blame you, okay? So again, Carter was almost kind of like the parent that's giving the speech to the children that the children don't want to hear, okay? He gets done with that speech and his approval rating hits almost rock bottom. He hits rock bottom during the Iranian hostage crisis. Iran had fallen to a takeover by the religious group that runs the country now, okay? Basically, we had promoted a guy named Reza Shah Pahlavi, who was this, for lack of better terminology, a military dictator. We had been promoting him because he provided some stability in the Middle East. Basically, because we supported his dictatorship, Iraq kind of left everybody alone over there because they were scared of them and they were scared of us, and they just kind of didn't fire weapons at each other. Well, during that time period, a religious leader by the name of Ayatollah Khomeini decided he was done with Reza Shah Pahlavi, and he encouraged his followers to overthrow the government, which they did. The new government was run by the religion, which means Iran is one of the few theocracies in the world. Now, why is that a problem? If a theocracy is a religious-run government, okay? So, like, the only one in the Christian faith would be the Vatican City. The Pope runs everything in the Vatican City, okay? But this means the Ayatollah Khomeini, and, you know, he's now dead, but there are others. The religious leaders of Iran really run the country. They're the ones that set the tone. They're the ones that make all the decisions. They still allow for a president who becomes their figurehead that talks, but the president can't do anything without looking at the religious leaders, the Ayatollahs, and saying, what do you think we need to do? Okay?
Religion and politics is not like cardinal rule.
Well, this is typically what we want, yeah, is to keep them separate. Here's the problem, though. What happens when that religious leader says, we must fight and die for Allah, all praise be to Allah, fight for Iran? What's everybody in the country basically required to do? Fight to the death, okay? So this is what kind of throws us off about Iran. Well, sure enough, the Ayatollah says to his followers, we need to expel the American influence from our country. His followers immediately go down the street and take the embassy by storm, taking a boatload of American hostages and making the situation a crisis where you have people who have taken over our embassy, taken all of our diplomatic people, and basically threatened their lives. Okay? Now they release most of them, but they keep the key diplomats as hostages at that point.
Didn't like Korea did that? Not Korea, North Korea did it?
They tried. They failed. Okay? This happened a lot of different places. Okay? This is the worst one we ever had. Okay? Well, I take that back. I don't know if you have ever heard of Benghazi in Libya during the Obama administration. That happened. It's the same basic concept. Okay? They took over and killed our diplomat. So this has happened a few times in modern history. Okay? Needless to say, in Iran, Carter's solution was to send a detachment of Marines to go in and try and basically rescue these people. On the way in, one of the helicopters crashed, killed a bunch of the Marines on board, and it became a huge just mess. Okay, they had to abandon the mission. Iran realized what we were going to do. They then threatened the hostages, like, we'll just kill them now then. It ended up being a huge problem. So that ended up being kind of the low point of the Carter presidency. Okay? The high point of it was he managed to get Israel and Egypt to finally sit down and hammer out a peace agreement, the Camp David Accords. If you don't know, the presidents have a retreat. They have a vacation spot up in Maryland called Camp David.
Why would
Okay?
anyone want to go to Maryland?
I'm sorry?
Why would anyone want to go to Maryland?
Well, in this case, it's getting out of D.C. Okay? Look, if you ever get a chance to read the book The Residence, it talks about the White House and its staff, and you know, it talks about first families living in the White House and what that is like. Think about it. If you're living in the most recognized house in the world, quite honestly, you know, maybe Buckingham Palace is a little bit more, but for the most part, the White House is pretty recognizable. If, you know, you're the daughter of the president and you decide to go outside and just sit and read a book or something, you're going to look out in your yard and you're going to see tons of tourists taking your photo.
That's really
Okay?
gross. Could we charge him?
No. Just understand, everything you do while you're in the White House is under a microscope. You can't walk around your own house because there are people walking in and out to meet, your dad or mom, whoever the president is, to meet with them in the Oval Office. Or you've got tour groups going, while you're upstairs trying to do your homework, you can hear tour groups walking around underneath your feet, basically, on the first floor, looking, oh, look, the green room, the red room.
Wait,
Like,
so the kids actually live there?
yes,
They
It depends.
not live
They
there?
get like private tutors.
Barron lived there for the last 2 years of the presidency. He went to school at a private school just down the road. Okay?
Oh, you would love to.
Yeah. But if you think about it, everywhere you go, you're followed by Secret Service. Very famously, Michelle Obama used to leave the White House once a year, roughly. She would dress down to the point, really baggy clothing and a baseball hat and stuff. And she would drive into rural, either Virginia or Maryland, just to go to a Target and walk around. Okay? But she still had Secret Service that were with her, who were kind of following her through the store.
So it was like so she felt normal?
She's trying to feel that way, but it's very difficult. At least when you go to Camp David, Secret Service aren't around because they're on the perimeter of the property. They're not in the house with you. So if you're looking for just some family time or just, man, I need to go away for the weekend and, walk outside. They have stables there that you could, so there are horses on the property if you want to go horseback riding. There's a pool, there's a tennis court. It's just, it was originally FDR's property. It was called Shangri-La, okay? They changed it to Camp David, and I can't remember exactly why they changed the name, but they changed it, and ever since it's been Camp David, and that's, if you wanted a vacation, that's where you go. Now, of course, Trump famously never went there. He went to his properties and whatever else, and there's no requirement saying you have to use it, and Obama really didn't use it all that much. If he went on vacation, he went to Hawaii and sat on a beach, okay? That was his vacation stuff, and George W. Bush, he used to just go down to Crawford, Texas to his ranch. The last president to really use Camp David was Clinton. Okay, Carter would use it for diplomacy. He believed that instead of sitting at the White House, which can be intimidating, I'm going to take people to Camp David and we're going to talk at Camp David. Let's, we'll go out for a hike or something. We'll talk. Nobody will bother us, and then we'll come back and we'll write it all down and we'll hammer out a peace agreement, which he manages to do between Israel and Egypt. Israel and Egypt had fought 3 major wars since the formation of Israel in 1947. And Egypt had lost all 3 pretty badly because Israel's kind of the JV squad of our military. Anything that we outgrow, we just give to them, but it's still way better than any other Arab nation in the Middle East when it comes to their military. Israel's got nuclear capabilities, for crying out loud. We gave them that.
So are we like homies?
Well, Israel would not survive without our help.
So like we have an alliance.
Yes.
Do we get anything from them?
We get the knowledge that we're helping out the Jewish state to survive because we are still guilt-ridden about the Holocaust.
Got it.
Because we knew about it and didn't do anything or didn't do enough.
Got it.
Okay? So again, we've been close with them. They really are our only solid ally in the region. So we tend to try and keep them close. But bottom line is we managed to get Egypt and Israel to sign a peace agreement in 1979. Now when that happens, this is a peace agreement that has lasted ever since. Okay? So again, it's pretty successful. Ladies. Bottom line is it's lasted for quite some time. And Egypt and Israel have not fought since. Now we did pay attention to that a few years back because Egypt has been going through a transition and they are now led by a pretty extreme Muslim group called the Muslim Brotherhood. And they have kind of said that their main mission in life is to destroy Israel. So we're not sure if this peace agreement is going to continue, but so far, knock on wood, it has. Okay? Now, Carter ends up losing to Reagan. He goes for re-election, but of course, it doesn't work out all that well. Okay? Carter gets kind of destroyed by Reagan in the 1980 general election. Ronald Reagan takes over. Now, Ronald Reagan doesn't have an exactly easy transition to the White House. Now, Iran basically, when he wins the election, they release the hostages, so Iran pretty much showed who they believed should be president of the United States. But, you know, Reagan doesn't exactly have the easiest transition because he basically survives an assassination attempt, okay? John Hinckley Jr. decides to jump out of a crowd, starts shooting randomly, hits Reagan. They hide it pretty well because Reagan, everybody thought he got shot, but then he was okay. Everything's fine. Yeah.
Which president was it that like survived an assassination attempt and then like he was giving a speech and a balloon popped and he was like
That was Reagan.
Okay, I thought so.
Reagan has a good sense of humor.
I didn't know.
Okay. Reagan gets shot in the stomach. It almost killed him. Okay, because it did slice through his liver, which can be a fatal gunshot wound. They managed to save his life, but yeah, when Nancy Reagan is taken into the hospital to see her husband, she walks into the hospital room. He looks directly at her and goes, "Sorry, sweetie, I forgot to duck." You know, like, I mean, that's just how he's just weird. But again, and by the way, Reagan is your first divorced president. He was your first one. That was the controversy about Ronald Reagan.
Really?
That he was divorced, yeah. He had married a woman by the name of Jane Wyman when he was back in Hollywood, you know, and they were two actors, and basically it just hit the skids, so he divorced her, and then married Nancy, who was she was an actress too, a very low-level actress, not somebody that was a you know, household name or anything.
She was B-lister.
But yeah, somebody that just kind of played in little roles on TV or movies or whatever else. But her name was Nancy Davis. Okay, she then becomes Nancy Reagan, and by all accounts, they had a very good relationship. But Nancy was fiercely defensive of Ronald. Like, you could not say anything bad about her husband. Okay, and his comfort was her primary importance. And look, if you ever get a chance to read, I keep referencing the Residence. It's a really good book, but you'll find out just how much the staff of the Residence really didn't like Nancy Reagan.
Really?
She was a handful. She was what we would consider high maintenance. Okay, like one of Ronald Reagan's favorite things to do was to sit around and read the newspaper on a Sunday, just have a quiet Sunday, you know. And so they're in the sitting room, and he's looking around like, "Where's the light switch?" So she's just like, "Oh my God, we have people to do that." She rings down. One of the electricians comes up. He goes, "What's up?" She goes, "We can't figure out how to turn on the lights." He's like, and he just walks over and turns on the light switch. And she was like, "Yeah, we're gonna need you to do that every Sunday." And he can't say, "But there it is. You know where it is now." You know, like he's so every Sunday he had to go up and put on the light switch for her.
That's annoying.
Like before they ever got to that room. She also wanted new flowers next to the bed every morning, which personally I would find that creepy. Somebody coming in and replacing flowers while you're sleeping. But if she didn't wake up to fresh flowers, that was kind of a problem.
So she was kind of taking like the
A very high maintenance lady.
What'd she do? She was taking the wealth out of him.
So, I mean, to say the least, and look, when they left the White House, Reagan had Alzheimer's, and there are questions as to whether or not he was already suffering from it while he was president of the United States. Nancy was, again, very protective of him. She took care of him, which, look, I've had Alzheimer's in my family. It's not easy taking care of somebody with Alzheimer's. So I'm talking badly about her, but you know, she was fiercely devoted to her husband. So you got to give her that, and devoted to her children as well. She was a you know, mama bear. Don't mess with her cubs and don't mess with her mate. You know, but it's still very difficult to be first lady because you're going to get criticized no matter what you do. So was she really made to be a first lady? Probably not. Her big thing was the war on drugs, which we'll get to here in a second. Now Reagan does have some kind of firsts, if you will. He survives the assassination attempt, and you are correct. He was giving a speech one time, balloon burst somewhere, and he just looked up, went, "Missed me," and he kept going. You know, just you have to have a sense of humor about things, I guess. Reagan does nominate the first female onto the Supreme Court. Sandra Day O'Connor, who is also sadly suffering from Alzheimer's. She had to resign. She left the Supreme Court during Trump's administration because of her affliction. She realized, you know, I'm kind of losing it. I'm not going to be able to to continue this. But to her credit, I don't know if you guys have ever been assigned anything on the website iCivics. She has devoted all kinds of time, resources, and energy to creating civics lessons for children, trying to educate people on how the government works, which January 6th has taught us we desperately need. You know, as many resources as possible to teach people how the government works, because obviously a lot of people don't. But Sandra Day O'Connor serves on the Supreme Court. She tends to be a little bit conservative, but not as conservative as Reagan initially thought she would be. But again, she served for roughly 20 years before resigning because of Alzheimer's issues. Tip O'Neill rose up to be the Speaker of the House. He was the foil to Ronald Reagan. He's a Democrat, and he's since passed on. So he was a Democrat from Massachusetts, and he and Reagan really had some knockdown, drag-out fights over policy. But to their credit, they always managed to find common ground. So if you ever hear somebody like your grandparents say, "Boy, I miss the days of good old Tip versus Ron," you know, that was kind of the big deal. Like, guaranteed, if your parents say, "Man, I really like Ronald Reagan," they didn't like Tip O'Neill. If your parents liked Tip O'Neill, they didn't like Ronald Reagan. But yet, they both kind of weirdly respect each other, you know, and they got things done, to be fair, which is why Ronald Reagan tends to get a lot of credit for some of the things that got done during his time as president. One of the low points was one of the largest terrorist attacks against the United States prior to 9/11, the 1983 Beirut bombing. This killed over 200 servicemen in Lebanon. Basically, a terrorist cell had put a bomb outside the barracks. So as these Marines were sleeping in their barracks, they were killed by this massive explosion. Okay? We had a massive counteroffensive against these folks, and we went after a lot of those terrorist cells, but we didn't do enough, quite honestly. What happened is, instead of them running into Syria or Jordan, which is kind of where we were hoping they would go and we'd root them out, they then relocated to places like Pakistan and Afghanistan. They went farther away, and it was hard for us to track. So the same people that were planning the bombings in 1983 turned around and kind of did the same stuff to us in 2001. So just kind of keep in mind that, you know, Reagan didn't have the easiest of times. He also had Reaganomics, which is sometimes called trickle-down economics. You may have heard this terminology before. Now, this actually starts with Calvin Coolidge, way back in the 1920s. And this is quite honestly what fueled the Roaring Twenties mentality. Now, in the 1920s, this probably worked because we were not a global economy yet. But Reagan basically tries to revamp it, and they called it Reaganomics. His own vice president, when he was running against him for the nomination, a guy named George H.W. Bush, called it voodoo economics because he said it just didn't make sense. Okay, Reaganomics basically, or trickle-down economics. The idea is that I'm going to cut the taxes of the people at the very top. Okay, the people who make the most money, I'm going to cut their taxes. The idea is that those people will take that money and spend it. By spending it in all these luxury things, like, you know, if Bill Gates, for example, gets his taxes cut and then he goes off and purchases a yacht. Well, we got to build the yacht, okay? And that company makes a lot of money and has to pay their employees. And then those employees go out and buy a new car. And the people in the car industry then, of course, get paid because they made that car. And then the people in the car industry go out and buy, you know, a nicer home. And so, you know, it just kind of trickles down through the economy. That's the mentality, that's the idea behind it. Now, some economists say that works. Other economists say no, it does not. And the reason they say it doesn't work is because we're more global now. So if I cut the taxes of Bill Gates, is Bill Gates going to buy a yacht from the United States, or is he going to buy it from another country? Most likely he's going to buy it from another country, and therefore the money trickles into somebody else's country. It doesn't trickle down to the poor here. Okay? That's the idea, is if it's not trickling down through our economy, it doesn't work. Or what happens if Bill Gates goes, "Oh, you cut my taxes, I have an extra $2 million, well, I'll just put that in a savings account." Well, then it doesn't trickle down anywhere. Or I'm going to put it in a bank account in the Cayman Islands. Well, that doesn't go anywhere. Okay? Or I gave it to charity. Oh, good. Which charity? The one in Africa. Well, now it's no longer inside the United States. So does trickle-down economics work? A lot of economists will say in the 1920s, yeah, because we weren't spending in other countries. But nowadays, yes, they are. So therefore, it's not trickling down to Americans, it's trickling down to other people, which is the problem. Okay? So needless to say, the jury's out as to whether or not Reaganomics worked. Most people believe that's what kind of led to our recession that happened during the Bush presidency. So poor George H.W. Bush, when he was president, he gets blamed for a recession that basically was the fault of Reaganomics. Okay? Now Bill Clinton likes that because he ends up becoming president because of it. Okay? Anyway, there is a problem with the air traffic controllers. Basically, the guys that are telling planes how to land and when to take off, they get upset because of their hours, they get upset because of their wages, so they strike. Reagan says it's illegal for you to do that, that's a national security issue. So he orders them back into work. When they refuse to go, he fires them. When people say, how are we going to land planes? He was like, we better start training new people. He got criticized on one side for getting rid of a bunch of hardworking people, and he got commended on another, saying, hey, you kind of stood up to a union and decided we're not going to allow you to just kind of, hoard this over the airlines, if you will. Look, if you're a Republican, that was a stroke of genius. If you're a Democrat, that's the worst thing ever. He was a very divisive president when it came to this, okay? So there's a reason why, if you watch Fox News, they hold up Reagan to be the greatest American president, and if you watch MSNBC, he's the biggest schmuck to ever be in the White House, okay? It just depends on your political persuasion, okay? The moral majority, this is a group of people that claim they got Reagan elected. These were our family values Republicans, the family values conservatives, that one man, one woman, get married, have a family, no one gets divorced, none of those children are gay, we have solid Christian moral leadership and foundation. And Reagan was their guy, which immediately made people who were criticizing Reagan to say, he's the divorce guy. Like, how are you going to support him? Which used to be the ultimate hypocrisy until Trump. Because the same people that supported Reagan, saying he's a good Christian man, supported Trump. 3 wives, cheated on 2 of them, probably all 3, let's be honest. He's not exactly the most moral guy in the world. Held the Bible upside down awkwardly in front of a church after gassing his own people. Not exactly. I don't remember ever walking into a church with tear gas being shot all around it, but again, not to get too political, but Reagan is kind of held up to be what a hypocrite or whatever else, and that was just because he got divorced. That was the 1980s, back when things were much simpler, obviously. Okay, but part of this moral crusade is, hey, we're going to get rid of drugs. This was Nancy Reagan's big policy, that we're going to have a war on drugs, because we always declare war on things we don't like. Okay, this is super controversial, though, because the war on drugs led to a number of people getting incarcerated for minor drug offenses. People would have small amounts of weed and go to jail for 25 years. Okay? Because of these policies, there are a number of people who are still in jail for things that are legal now. In certain states, the weed that was on the person at the time in 1994 is legal now. It's fine. Okay? And of course, not surprisingly, this was during the crack cocaine epidemic in the cities. So the majority of people getting arrested were minorities. Okay?
Pablo Escobar?
No, he was cocaine. That was the fashionable drug. Okay? But this is where, of course, we're calling hypocrisy now, because everybody's worried about, the heroin epidemic. Well, the heroin epidemic is happening in places like Harrison. Out in the middle of nowhere, most of the time affecting white America. Are we arresting them and putting them in prison for 25, 30 years, or are we trying to get them treatment at treatment centers? Trying to break them of the habit and carrying Narcan everywhere to make sure that we revive them and save their lives. A lot of African Americans and Hispanics are saying, during the 80s when we were getting arrested for crack cocaine, there was not, let's get them into treatment. It was, let's put them in a cell and let them rot there for 20 years. Okay, so we have definitely changed our perception about the drug war, if you will. Okay, Iran-Contra, another low point for Reagan. This is where we were basically selling weapons, using the money to then support anti-communist propaganda and anti-communist efforts in other countries. And of course, when we're talking about the communists at the time, it's Mikhail Gorbachev who's leading the Soviet Union during this time period, and leading the Soviet Union to basically dissolution. This is the end or the fall of the Soviet Union. We'll talk about the 1984 election and others in the next class session next week.